There seems to be no end to what we can accomplish with behavior analysis. Well, that is, if we do it right. Researchers have spent countless hours developing and testing and failing and testing again and failing again and crying and refining and experimenting to finalize procedures that will be effective. We rely on all of that hard work to be able to provide the quality of care that we are known for. So, yes, let's go out there and implement these procedures perfectly. Sounds easy enough, right? Wrong, wrong, wrongo, wrong, wrong, wrong. Unfortunately, it turns out that doing things perfectly is not very likely. For example, you happen to be tired one day. This fatigue could affect how well you perform specific tasks. There's also something known as drift. Simply implementing procedures over and over again could result in you performing differently. Let's say someone like your supervisor decides to watch you implement. This can affect your performance as well. Lastly, your history can affect how well specific skills will maintain over time. These are just some of the variables that can affect an individual's procedural integrity. Now, before you panic, there is still hope. There are groups of researchers that decided to test to see just how accurately do we need to be running behavior analytic procedures for them to still show favorable results. This performance accuracy is known as procedural integrity, and procedural fidelity, and treatment integrity, and fidelity. Basically, there are variations of this, but they all relatively mean the same thing: the degree to which a prescribed protocol is implemented correctly. Procedural integrity can vary anywhere from 0%, which is doing everything incorrectly, to 100%, which is doing everything correctly. So to test this across of the procedures, the researchers manipulated varying levels of procedural integrity to see how that would affect the learning of another individual. Now here's where it gets even better. One group of researchers decided to compile these into one research article to compare the procedural integrities and their effects on behavior change. This was done by Dr. Brand and colleagues, and they published their work in the Journal of Behavioral Education. You should check out the article for yourself after we provide you with a summary of their findings. We can go through some of the main takeaways. First, best outcomes of behavior analytic procedures seem to come out with perfect implementation. Pretty straightforward. The learners acquired skills better with this level of fidelity. Now, as stated previously, this is very unlikely to maintain. So it is recommended to have frequent supervision of individuals implementing procedures to make sure that they maintain their skills over time. The second takeaway was that the learner outcomes were less predictable with lower levels of procedural fidelity. Here's an example from one of the articles by Jenkins et al. Now, when the procedures were implemented with perfect fidelity, they showed reliably better performance from the learners when compared to the lower levels of fidelity. However, when comparing the procedures when half of the steps were performed incorrectly versus when all of the steps were performed incorrectly, you can see that 3 out of the 4 learners actually performed better with the worst fidelity level. Next, authors noticed that across of the articles, a couple of the learners were still learning the skill being taught even with low procedural fidelity. However, the acquisition of the skills took much longer or required many more trials when compared to high levels of fidelity. This further pushes the point that we need to make sure that we are providing procedures with near perfect fidelity. The authors also recommended staying alert on how long learning is taking to occur. A potential cause for the delay could be due to low procedural fidelity. The final takeaway for us was the effect of initial exposure to a certain level of procedural fidelity. St. Peter Pipkins and colleagues found that initial exposure to low levels of procedural fidelity not only took longer to teach, but also those effects carried over after transitioning to higher fidelity implementation. These effects were not seen when initially exposed to high procedural fidelity. These provide evidence for the detrimental effects that initial poor fidelity can have on the learner's rate of acquisition of skills. The authors recommended that when initially training individuals to implement procedures, they be trained to perfect fidelity prior to working with learners to avoid the detrimental effects seen in previous studies. So remember to train, 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 and remember to pay close attention to procedural fidelity.